Lesson 36, Comparison of Adjectives, Declension of Comparatives. Hi everybody, welcome back to Lenny's Latin class. Today, as I said a moment ago, we're on Lesson 36, and that's on page 109. Our lesson for today does not cover the most exciting material ever, but it's still pretty important if you want to know how to express things in Latin and how to read texts. And so what we're talking about today is the 3 different degrees of adjectives. And what do I mean when I say degrees? So the easiest way to explain this is to simply give you an example. Think of the adjective big. If you want to simply describe something, you'll say it's big. If you want to describe something in comparison to something else, you'll say it's bigger. You'll add the ending ER. And if you want to say that something's bigger than all the other ones, you'll say it's the biggest. Okay, so big, bigger, biggest. Those are the 3 degrees of adjectives. And those 3 different degrees have names. They're called positive, comparative, and superlative. If you say that something is big, you are using the positive form of the adjective. If you say something is bigger, you're using the comparative form. Okay, bigger with the ER ending is comparative. Why? Because you're comparing it to something else. You're saying it's bigger than something. So it has within it the idea of comparing 2 things. And then when you say biggest, that particular form is called the superlative. Okay, so you have 3 degrees of adjectives: positive, comparative, superlative, big, bigger, biggest. And if you know the Latin roots for those different names, it can help you remember them. The word positive is related to the Latin verb pono, that's P-O-N-O, which means to put or place, or to lay something down. Pono, ponere, posui, positum. The 4th principal part there is positum, and you can see where we would get words from it like positive, and a slew of other English words like postpone, propose, preposition. All those words contain that POS root word, which means to put or place. And pono can mean all kinds of other things. You have to sort of read it in context. So with the positive degree of an adjective, the idea is you're just laying down or establishing the quality of something. You're just putting it out there, what the descriptor is. The comparative form is relatively self-explanatory. You can see, of course, our English word compare is related to that. The C-O-M part of the word, it's really the prefix con, C-O-N, which means with or together. And then paro can mean all kinds of different things, like to get, to prepare, to obtain, to set up. And so the literal meaning here is the idea of putting 2 things next to each other, like matching them up or pairing them up. So the English word compare is a fairly direct descendant of the Latin roots here. And finally, the word superlative is also from Latin roots. The super part of it is the Latin preposition super, which means over or above. And then let me draw your attention to the LAT part of the word. That root word comes from the Latin verb fero, which is spelled F-E-R-O. Fero means to bear or carry or bring. It can also mean all kinds of different things. And the 4 principal parts are fero, fere, tuli, latum. It's somewhat irregular because the 4 principal parts don't follow the kind of pattern you would expect. We have all kinds of English words related to fero, like infer, defer, prefer. All those contain the the root word from the first principal part, but we also have English words that have the LAT root word that comes from the fourth principal part, latum. And so that's what we have here. Superlative has the Latin roots within it that mean to carry something above or to carry something beyond. That's the general idea. So with a superlative, if you're saying something is the biggest or the longest or whatever, you're saying that it's beyond all the others. It's above all the others. And so that's the work being done by the super prefix. Positive, you're just laying down the meaning of something. You're laying down a descriptor. Comparative, you're comparing something to something else. And superlative, you're saying it's beyond all the others or above all the others. So if you know the Latin roots behind those words, it helps you remember what they mean. Another quick example before we go, and that's what they give us here in this particular paragraph. They give us long, longer, longest. Okay, again, in English, those are the three different degrees of adjectives. Long is the positive degree. Longer, with the ER ending, is the comparative degree because it's longer than something. You're comparing it to something. Longest, with the EST ending, is superlative because you're saying it's above all the others. It's longer than any other. Okay, so in English, that is the basic, most common pattern for the 3 degrees of adjectives. Long, longer, longest. In the comparative form, you add ER. In the superlative form, you add EST. So that is the most standard pattern for how to form the positive, comparative, and superlative in English. But it doesn't work for every adjective. For some adjectives, you simply cannot add ER to make the comparative form and EST to make the superlative form. For example, the word powerful. Imagine you want to say the adjective powerful, and then you want to say that in the comparative. So would you say powerfuler? No, you can't do it. It doesn't really work with that particular adjective. So for some adjectives, you have to use a supplementary word like more. So for the adjective powerful, if you want to say the comparative form, you have to use 2 words. You have to say more powerful. So the positive form is powerful. The comparative form is more powerful, not powerfuler. Likewise, with the superlative form, you don't say powerfulest. Again, you have to use 2 words, and you have to use the word most. So you'll say most powerful. So positive is powerful, comparative is more powerful, and superlative is most powerful. Same thing for an adjective such as difficult. Difficult is the positive form. For the comparative form, you don't say difficulter, you say more difficult. And for the superlative, you don't say difficultest, you say most difficult. So in English, we have a couple of different ways to make the comparative and superlative forms of an adjective. And so, our task in this particular lesson is to learn how to say those same kinds of things in Latin. So in Latin, you have those same 3 degrees, positive, comparative, and superlative. So the question is, how do we express that in Latin? And they give us the example here in section 291. They say longus, longior, longissimus. So what are those 3 forms there? Longus is the positive form. That adjective simply means long. Longus, longa, longum is a first and second declension adjective. If you want to make it comparative, you get longior, which, and this is very important, so listen up, this is a third declension adjective. Comparatives in Latin are always third declension adjectives. Okay, so longior is masculine and feminine, nominative singular. To make the genitive singular forms, it would be longioris. So longior, longioris That's the kind of pattern you're going to see with comparatives. Again, the comparative forms are third declension adjectives. Moving on to longissimus, that's the superlative form. It means longest. And again, this is important. The superlatives are going to be first and second declension adjectives. So they're pretty easy. So longissimus would be masculine, longissima would be feminine, longissimum would be neuter. So superlatives aren't really too hard. And positive adjectives aren't too hard either because you're already familiar with them. There's nothing new to learn. The one you need to keep your eye on really is the comparative forms because that's kind of challenging. One last note before we move on. The positive form of an adjective, as you already know, it's not always going to be a first and second declension adjective. That can be first and second declension, or you could have a third declension adjective as the positive form. And we've already studied that, so you already know all that. I'm just reminding you of it. Okay, let's turn the page to page 110 and look at section 292. It says here, the comparative is formed by adding IOR for the masculine and feminine and IUS for the neuter to the base of the positive. Okay, let's stop there. So here we're taking a closer look mainly at the comparative form. As I said before, comparative adjectives are going to be third declension adjectives. So let's look at the first line here in this box in section 292. We have longus as the example adjective there. So longus, longa, longum is the positive form. That particular adjective happens to be a first and second declension adjective. And then for the comparative, we go to a third declension form. Okay, longior is masculine and feminine, but for neuter, you get an unusual ending. You get IUS. So in Latin, if you want to say that some masculine noun is longer, you say longior. If you want to say that a feminine noun is longer, you say longior. But if you want to say that a neuter noun is longer, you say longius. So imagine the noun oppidum, right? Oppidum means town. So if you want to say a longer town, you would say oppidum longius, the longer town. Of course, in Latin, adjectives of size or quantity oftentimes come before the noun they modify. So if you saw a longer town, you might see longius oppidum. You might see the adjective coming first, and in fact, you'll see that in our exercises for this lesson. For the comparative forms, you have a little bit of stuff to get used to. You have to get accustomed to that IUS ending for the neuter singular form. We'll take a closer look at the declension pattern there in a moment. And then looking at the superlative form, not too hard, longissimus, longissima, longissimum. That's a first and second declension adjective. Long, longer, longest in Latin is longus, longior, longissimus. Moving on to the next one, that's gravis, which means serious or heavy. And so they show you the base, or what you might call the stem. By the way, gravis is a third declension adjective in the positive form. So gravis, grave, is an adjective of two terminations. And then again, the comparative form is definitely going to be a third declension adjective, always. So here we have gravior for masculine singular, gravior for feminine singular, and then gravius for neuter singular, in the nominative case, that is. We've already covered third declension adjectives, so there's no need to talk about gravis again. But gravior, again, it's similar to an adjective of two terminations, except ius is the neuter ending, so that's different. So if you wanted to say in Latin, a heavier sword, you'd say gladius gravior. A heavier sword, that's masculine. But if you wanted to say something neuter, like a shield, a scutum, you would say scutum gravius, a heavier shield. ius, again, that's the neuter nominative singular ending. Moving to the superlative degree, we have gravissimus, gravissima, gravissimum. Not too difficult because it's just a first and second declension adjective. In the last line here in this box, we have potens. And again, in the far left column, they give us the stem or the base, potent. This also happens to be a third declension adjective. This is, I believe, an adjective of one termination. So potens is masculine, feminine, and neuter. Again, that's a third declension adjective. They're in the positive degree, potens. Moving to the comparative, we have potentior. We have the IOR ending added to the base or the stem. So potentior means more powerful. And if something is neuter, you would say it's potentius, to be more powerful. A more powerful shield would be scutum potentius. A more powerful woman would be femina potentior. A more powerful man, vir potentior. But for neuter, you get the ius ending. Moving to the superlative, potentissimus. It's quite a mouthful. Potentissima, potentissimum. Not too difficult because it's only a first and second declension adjective. Okay, so the standard ending for the superlative, as you can see in the paragraph here in section 292, is ISSIMUS, issimus. That's the standard ending to make an adjective superlative. So for potens, we have potens, potentior, potentissimus for the 3 degrees. Powerful, more powerful, most powerful. Let's move on now to section 293, and let's look at a slightly different form of the superlative for adjectives that end with er. And you'll see these adjectives both in the third declension and first and second declension. So acer is a third declension adjective. Liber is a first and second declension adjective. So both kinds of adjectives can end in er. So for acer, we have acer, acris, acre. For the positive, that's an adjective of 3 terminations. In the comparative, we have acrior, acrior, acrius. But the superlative is different. Instead of acerissimus or something like that, we get the R being doubled. Instead of having 2 S's, we get the R being doubled. So we have acerimus. And that's a first and second declension adjective, acerimus, acerima, acerimum. Same thing for liber, which is a first and second declension adjective. That means free. Liber, libera, liberum. That's the positive degree. In the comparative, we get liberior. Of course, in the neuter, it's liberius. And then in the superlative, we get the same thing as before. We get the doubling of the letter R. Instead of liberissimus or something like that, we get liberimus. Okay, so for adjectives that end in er, like acer, liber, you'll get 2 R's in the superlative form. Let's move on now to section 294, and let's look at a few more superlatives that don't have the ISSIMUS ending that we saw earlier. Section 294 says 6 positives in LIS, that means that end with LIS, form the superlative by adding LIMUS to the base of the positive. So earlier we saw ISSIMUS as the most standard ending for the superlative, but then we saw a few that have a doubled letter R instead of a letter S. We saw acerimus and liberimus. And now we're seeing superlatives that have a doubled letter L. So the third declension adjective, facilis, facile, which means easy, that's an example of this kind of adjective. So notice in the superlative, you get facilimus, not facissimus or facilissimus or something like that. And according to the book, there are only 6 of these. So not too many to look out for. Facilis, difficilis, similis, dissimilis, graculus, and humilis. So we have 3 flavors of superlative adjective to look out for. The kind with a doubled S, like longissimus. The kind with a doubled letter R, like acerimus. And the kind with a doubled L, like facilimus. Notice that still, no matter what form it is, they're all first and second declension adjectives. All superlatives take the endings of the first and second declension. So really, they're not too difficult. Let's move on now to section 295, and let's take a closer look at the declension pattern for comparatives. As I have mentioned several times, comparatives are always third declension adjectives. And you have to watch out for the neuter singular ending in the nominative, which is ius. So here they say, declension of comparatives. The comparative of an adjective belongs to the third declension. Learn the declension of the model comparative longior in Appendix 13. So let's do that. Let's turn to the appendix and take a moment to just examine the declension pattern. Section 13 of the appendix starts on page 252 and extends to 253. And so longior is the second paradigm on page 253. One way to approach this is to think of it as an adjective of 2 terminations. Now, it's not really an adjective of 2 terminations. That would be like the one right above this, fortis, where you have fortis for masculine nominative singular, fortis for feminine nominative singular, and then forte for neuter nominative singular. Okay, that's a real classic case of an adjective of 2 terminations from the third declension. These comparatives are similar to that in the sense that the masculine and feminine are the same, and then the neuter is different. So it's kind of sort of similar, but not really. The comparison kind of breaks down after that because, again, the neuter nominative singular ends with ius, not a letter E. And from the perspective of a student, someone learning all this for the first time, the thing that potentially is confusing about this is the fact that it ends with us. You know, when you're a student, you associate us with the second declension masculines, like gladius, words like that. So the us ending here can be confusing because you think, oh, us, that means masculine. But not always. Here, the ending really is ius, not us. And don't forget, there are some third declension neuter nouns that end with us. For example, the word tempus, which means time. You might look at the word tempus and think, oh, tempus, that's us, that's a second declension masculine. But no, it's not really second declension, it's third declension. The declension pattern is tempus, temporis. It's neuter, so the nominative plural would be tempora, and accusative plural, tempora. So tempus temporis is an example of a third declension noun that ends with us, but is neuter. So you can't always assume that if something ends with us, that it's masculine. This is why it pays to know what declension each noun is from. When you're a student learning all this for the first time, you might think to yourself, wow, this is confusing. I just want us to be associated with one gender. I don't want to have to think through it so much like this. The good news is that over time, as you get accustomed to the vocabulary, you just start to know what a declension each noun is from because you see it in texts. As you read more and more, you just get accustomed to it. And frankly, this is one of the reasons why, to me, learning how to speak Latin is so important for your education. Because when you speak Latin with other people, you hear these words used so much that you just start to learn them by ear. It's one thing to read texts and see these words occasionally in a text, but it's another thing to just constantly use these words, hear others use them in conversation, use them to actually express something that you want to say to someone. See, when you begin to use the Latin language to actually communicate something that you need to communicate to someone, it's really a game changer. It makes Latin no longer some kind of language that's just preserved in text, but it brings it to life and makes it something that actual people are using to say real things to each other. So as I always say, if you learn to speak Latin, you will learn the Latin language faster and better, especially with all these unusual forms, unfamiliar forms. When you speak Latin, the unfamiliar soon becomes familiar through constant and frequent use. So again, with forms like these third declension adjectives with different numbers of terminations, the declension pattern for comparatives, it's a lot easier to learn all this stuff when you're using the words, speaking the language, talking to other people, and actually just using these words. It becomes less of an exercise of memorizing a chart and more of an exercise of using the words for things and actually hearing them over and over. In fact, I would even say that for me, speaking Latin for so many years now has really helped me to learn a lot of these forms. It's just great practice, and it's only going to help you if you do it. So anyway, my sermon about speaking Latin is now over. I'll move on, but definitely learn to speak Latin and practice speaking it if at all possible. Back to our declension pattern of longior on page 253. Quick review, the masculine and feminine nominative forms are the same, longior, and then in the neuter you get longius with the ius ending. One other thing I'd like to point out here is that this is not an I stem declension pattern. If you look one chart above this at fortis, that's an I stem. You'll see in the genitive plural fortium with ium as the ending. See, the letter I is there as part of the genitive plural ending. Also, an alternate ending for the accusative plural is is instead of es. So those are two sure signs that that particular adjective has the declension pattern of an I stem noun. And I made the observation a few lessons ago that all these third declension adjectives have an I stem kind of pattern to them. So you might expect longior, because it's a third declension adjective, you might expect it to be an I stem, but notice that it's not. Take a look at the genitive plural. Okay, we have longiorum for the genitive plural for all three genders. It's not longiorium with an I, it's longiorum. The genitive stem here is longior, so we add on the endings to that stem. In the dative singular, we get longiori, accusative singular, longiorum, all the standard endings that you would expect. But with a couple of differences, notice that in the ablative singular, all the other adjectives end with the letter I in the ablative singular. We have forms like acri, forti, potenti, but for longior, for this comparative, we just have the letter E, longiore. Also in the nominative plural, we have longiora. Again, this is not an I stem pattern, so there's no I in that neuter plural ending. It's not longioria, it's just longiora. Notice also that for the accusative plural, masculine and feminine, we have longiores, and we do not have the little parentheses there with the alternate is ending. That is ending is something that you would expect from I stem nouns. But again, it's not here in this chart because this declension pattern is not an I-stem kind of declension pattern. Another thing to notice is, as I've said many times before, the neuter nominative and neuter accusatives are always going to be the same. So neuter nominative singular, longius, neuter accusative singular, longius. They are the same. Neuter nominative plural, longiora, neuter accusative plural, longiora. So they're the same too. So these are just a few things to notice about the declension pattern for comparatives. And, as I go through this with you, I think to myself that this is actually a pretty good exercise for students to internalize just what makes a third declension word of any kind, whether it's a noun or adjective, what makes it I-stem and what makes it not I-stem. So this exercise we're going through here of looking at this comparative declension pattern, it's actually a pretty good exercise for learning about I-stem characteristics of third declension words. In fact, let's review that one more time before we leave by comparing again fortis and longior. So fortis in the ablative singular has the letter I. Longior in the ablative singular has the letter E. So fortis is I-stem, longior is not I-stem. So the ablative singular is different. The accusative plural, masculine and feminine, for fortis has the alternate is ending. For longior, it does not, because it's not an I-stem. Neuter nominative plural and neuter accusative plural for fortis are fortia with an I there. For longior, it does not have the I there. It's just longiora. That's another difference. Genitive plural, we have fortium with an I there. We have ium as the ending. For longior, there is no I in the genitive plural because it's not an I-stem. So that's actually a good exercise for noticing those different spots where something being I-stem makes an actual spelling difference. Okay, let's move on now to section 296, and let's talk about some of the finer shades of meaning that can be expressed in Latin by the comparative degree and the superlative degree of adjectives. So let's look at this first sentence here in section 296. It says, the comparative is usually translated by more or er, the er ending. Let's stop right there. Okay, so ordinarily a comparative is going to be translated into English simply by adding the er ending. If we see longior in Latin, we can translate that comparative into English simply by saying longer with the er ending. If it's some other adjective like potens, powerful, we won't say powerful-er. We'll use the word more. We'll say more powerful to render that comparative into English. Okay, so the comparative is usually translated by the word more or by the ending er. So that's the usual, most plain way to translate it. But now look at what they say next. They say, but sometimes by to or rather. What do they mean by that? What they mean is that in Latin, the comparative degree can express other things other than just simply, longer, stronger, more difficult, more powerful. The meaning expressed by the comparative in Latin can go beyond that simple translation. It can also express the idea that something is rather so. Something is rather long, rather difficult, rather powerful, rather easy. Okay, so if you see the word longior in Latin, of course, it can mean longer. That's the easiest way to translate it. But depending on the context, it could also be expressing the idea of rather long. Let's say you're talking about a road, and you say, boy, this road is rather long, or this trip is rather long. In Latin, you can express that with the comparative. Literally, you might be saying, this road is longior. This road is longer. But the sense of it, the thing you're trying to express, really is that it's rather long. You're not necessarily comparing it to anything. You're just making sort of a general statement about it. Notice also they mention the word too. In Latin, the comparative degree of an adjective can express that something is too much of something. So the word longior in Latin could possibly mean, depending on the context, it could mean that something is too long. You might have a spear, and the spear is too long for you to use. You might say, hey, this spear is too long. That's another kind of meaning that can be expressed by the comparative degree in Latin. So if you see the word longior in Latin, it could mean simply longer, or it could mean too long, or it could mean rather long. Any of those three shades of meaning could be communicated by that comparative degree. How do you know which one it's talking about? How do you know what's being communicated? You have to just look at the context. The context will tell you what is being expressed and how to render it into English. Likewise, the superlative degree can also communicate other things besides just, longest, strongest, easiest, most difficult. Let's take a look. It says here the superlative, starting on the second line, the superlative by most or the ending est. So that's the normal way to translate a superlative. Longest, easiest, most difficult. So you can use the word most to do it, or you can add the ending est to translate that into English. The idea being that it is more so of that thing than anything else. Longissimus in Latin means longest. So that could simply mean longest, but it can also mean very long. If something is longissimus in Latin, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're saying that it's the longest of a certain group. You could just be making a general statement saying that it's very long. Now you might be thinking, this is kind of weird to use the comparative and superlative in these ways. But it's really not. We do the exact same thing in English. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Imagine you're watching a commercial on television and they're advertising a car. And they want to say that the car they're advertising gets really good gas mileage. They might say on the commercial, buy our car because it's the more economical choice. So when they say it's the more economical choice, they just used a comparative. Were they really comparing it specifically to anything? Not really. They might be implying that their car is more economical than other cars on the market. But what really they're saying is our car is a rather economical choice. So they're using that comparative in kind of a general kind of way. They're not exactly making a direct comparison to something else. They're simply saying something about the quality of their own cars. And likewise, with the superlative degree, we use it in English to say that something is very much of something. Let's say that I am at work and I go to a really long meeting. And when the meeting is over, I come out of the meeting and I say to my friend, boy, that meeting was the longest. Do I really mean that out of all the meetings I've ever had, that meeting was actually the longest? No, not necessarily. What I'm really saying is that, boy, that meeting was very long. So that's a colloquial way to express the idea that the meeting was very long. Another quick example, if I go to a really terrible restaurant and the food is awful and the service is awful, I might say to my friend, boy, that restaurant was the worst. Now, I'm not really comparing it directly to anything, and it may not be that it's the worst restaurant in the world. What I'm actually saying is that it was very bad. It's just a colloquial way to say that it was very bad. So here's my point, is that the way they use the comparative and the superlative in Latin, we do the same thing in English. So it's really not very foreign to you, or it ought not be foreign to you. Longior, the comparative, you could be saying that something is longer, or that it's too long, or that it's rather long. Any of those finer shades of meaning could be expressed by that comparative. Likewise, The superlative longissimus, it could be saying that something is the longest or that it's just simply very long. So those same meanings that we use these for in English, you'll see that also in Latin. And again, as I said before, the key here is to look at the context and see how the word is being used in a text. Let's move on now to section 297, and let's talk about our vocabulary for this lesson. First, we have the third declension noun augmen, which is neuter. The genitive singular form is augmenus. The nominative plural form would be augmena. And the idea here is that, as you can see, it's an army on the march or a line of troops. In today's military terms, you might refer to it as a formation. You know, if you have soldiers standing in some kind of block or square, we call it a formation. And the sergeant might say, "Hey, get in formation," or "Clean up this formation." So if you have a line of troops marching down the road or a block of soldiers marching along, that's an augmen. So the basic idea here is that it's troops that are moving, troops that are on the march, troops that are in motion. They're not just sitting there or standing there in formation, they're going somewhere. And if you look in the dictionary, you know, every student of Latin ought to be aware of the famous Latin dictionary known as Lewis and Short. Lewis and Short is the most complete Latin dictionary that I know of, perhaps except for the Oxford Latin Dictionary. But the good thing about the Lewis and Short dictionary is that you can find it online for free. Oftentimes, if you're using Wiktionary, which is Wikipedia's dictionary part, if you look up a Latin word on Wiktionary, it'll give you a link to the Lewis and Short entry. So if you look in Lewis and Short, what they explain about the word augmen is that it has to do with movement and forward progress, or a procession. And in fact, the word augmen can also mean the motion of water in a stream. So you see there it's, again, related to the idea of motion or progress, you know, forward progress. And this kind of Latin noun that ends with men, that kind of noun is created from a verb. For example, in Latin, there's a word tegmen, T-E-G-M-E-N, tegmen, which means a covering. And it comes from the verb tego, which means to cover. So the verb tego means to cover, and then when you take the root of it and you add men, it means that it's the product of that activity. Okay, so tego means to cover. Tegmen is the product of the act of covering. Therefore, a tegmen is a covering. Okay, and that's what we have here with the word augmen. It's from the verb ago, and so, you know, the verb ago in Latin can mean all kinds of things. It can mean to do, drive. It can just mean almost anything. Very much like our word do in English. So the idea with augmen is that it's from the verb ago, but with that men ending. As a noun, augmen means the product of the verb ago. So the main point here is when you think of the term augmen, think of motion and troops that are moving somewhere. The word achies has to do with troops being formed up for battle. But augmen carries with it the idea that troops are on the march. That's the basic difference there. Next, we have a specialized kind of military term, novissimum augmen. Okay, notice that this is the word augmen. We just examined that word. It means something like a formation or a line of troops or an army on the march. And here we have it being described by the superlative adjective novissimum. So novissimum augmen literally would mean the newest formation. But they want you to translate it as the rear of an army or the rear guard. Now, why would that be the rear of an army or the rear guard? In this particular context, the word novissimum means last. And here's the best way I can think of to explain it to you. Imagine you're watching a parade. Imagine you are standing on the side of a road watching a parade go by. And the parade has 10 different parts to it. And part number 1 goes by, part number 2 goes by. When you get to the end of the parade and the end of the parade starts to march by you, from your point of view, the last part of the parade will be the newest part. To you, it's the newest. The other 9 parts that you saw, they've already moved down the road. And to you, those are old because they've already gone by. But this new part coming into view, well, that's the end of the parade. So in that sense, the last part of the parade is the newest part to a viewer. So I think that's the reason why novissimum agmen, literally the newest formation, means the rear of an army. Because from the perspective of a bystander, the newest group to show up is the last group of soldiers in that formation, in that long line of soldiers going by. Again, the idea with an agmen is that they are on the march. They're moving somewhere. That's the idea here. Likewise, we have primum agmen, literally the first formation. And as you can see, they want you to translate that as the front of an army, or the van, in the sense of the vanguard. You know, if something is the vanguard, it means it's the first, or perhaps on the cutting edge of something, pioneers. So why is it called primum agmen? Because, again, if you're watching a parade of soldiers go by, the first formation you see is going to be the front of the formation, or the front of the parade. So in this particular context, primum means first or front, and novissimum means last, in the sense of last to go by, and in the sense of the newest to come into view. Next, we have another third declension noun, cohors, cohortus, a feminine noun that means cohort. This word is a specialized military term that deals with how you divide up a legion. Okay, a legion was, in theory, about 5,000 soldiers, but then you would have subgroups within that legion. And the way these terms are used depends on the time in Roman history that you're talking about. Every student of the ancient Romans ought to know about someone named Marius, who flourished somewhere around the year 105 BC to 100 BC. That was the height of his career. And one of the major things that Marius did was he took the Roman army and reshaped it from a militia kind of army to a professional standing army. Okay, so what's the difference between a militia and a professional standing army? What's the difference? Well, a militia is the kind of army where it's just civilians who do their normal job all the time, but then if there's a war, they put down whatever they were doing and temporarily pick up weapons and suddenly form a military force. So that's forming a military force on an as-needed basis. And then when the conflict is over, everyone goes back to the jobs they were doing. Sort of like a National Guard or something like that. So they're not professional soldiers, they're soldiers who suddenly form an army when needed. So that is a militia type of army, and that's the kind of army that Rome had before the days of Marius. So what Marius did was he created a standing professional army, the kind of army that's always on duty, even when there's no conflict. So he made arrangements for pay for army soldiers. He made arrangements to reorganize the Roman army. And so he did some rearranging and recalibrating of the different divisions of how you divide up the Roman army into groups. Before the time of Marius, you had these older formations known as maniples. But then from the time of Marius forward, you have these new names and new divisions of things. So Julius Caesar's career in Gaul starts roughly 40 years after the time of Marius. So in Caesar's Gallic Wars, we see the term cohors because that's a term associated with the way the Roman army was divided up during Caesar's time. Later, in the time of the Roman Empire, we have some more changes to the army. But anyway, definitely one thing that every Latin student ought to know about is Marius, his career, and the changes he made in the Roman army, transforming it from a militia type of army that was called up on an as-needed basis, transforming that into more of a professional standing army that was paid and professionally trained, etc., etc. Next, we have the first and second declension adjective, Fiermas, firma, firmum, which means strong or firm. That's not too difficult to remember. Next, a third declension adjective, ferax, genitive singular, feracis, which means fertile. This looks to me like an adjective of one termination. Moving on, we have nobilis, nobile. That's another third declension adjective. This one looks to me like an adjective of two terminations. So nobilis would be masculine nominative singular. Again, nobilis would be feminine nominative singular. And then for neuter nominative singular, you'd have nobile. They give three definitions here: famous, noble, or well-born. In English, we have the word noble, which describes someone's character. If someone is noble, it means they're upstanding, righteous, they have good character, they stay strong in times of difficulty, perhaps. But when you're talking about societies that had different social classes, like well-defined social classes, like the aristocracy, the word noble often ends up meaning someone who's in that top social class. And that's why they have the third one here, well-born. It means you're born into an aristocratic family. In some societies, you have class that is determined by wealth. And so you can move up or down the social ladder depending on how much money you have. But in other societies, class is not determined by how much money you have. Class is determined by birth. For example, in England, if you are born into an aristocratic family, it does not matter if you're rich or poor. You still are an aristocrat because you were born into that family. And likewise, if you're not an aristocrat, if you are what they might refer to as a commoner, it doesn't matter if you win the lottery and become a billionaire. The amount of money you have doesn't matter. You're still not aristocracy because you weren't born into it. This is a concept that sometimes Americans have a hard time understanding. That is class by birth. You're either born into it or not born into it. We tend to think of, here in America, we tend to think of social class as referring to money. If we say upper class, we mean wealthy. Lower class, we mean poor. But in some societies, that's simply not the case. It's class by birth. And that is how ancient Rome was. They had an aristocracy with important ruling families, and you simply had to be born into one of these families in order to be in the aristocracy. So when you think of the word nobilis, try to think of it as aristocratic or well-born, as they have here. Not so much as noble in the sense of having good character. Think of it as noble in the sense of being a member of the aristocracy. Next, we have a new verb, impendeo. This is a compound verb. We have the preposition in plus pendeo. So the idea is to overhang. If something is looming over you, that's impendeo. The letter in the preposition in turns into the letter m before the letter p. So instead of in pendeo, it's impendeo. Lastly, we have circumduco, another compound verb. You already know the verb duco, which means to lead, and then circum means around, so literally to lead around. Let's move on now to our translation exercises for this lesson. Let's do all the exercises except for number 21. Go ahead and turn off the recording and try these exercises on your own, and when you're finished, turn the recording back on and we'll go over them together. Okay, hopefully by now you've finished your homework. Let's take a look at the exercises here in section 298. Number 1 says, Latius flumen. The word flumen is a third declension noun that means river, and it happens to be neuter. Latius is a form of the adjective latus, lata, latum, which means wide. Here, it is the comparative degree. So the most literal meaning here would be wider. Notice that in Latin, the adjective usually comes after the noun, except adjectives that pertain to size or quantity. So here we have an adjective that is referring to the size of something, that something is wide, and so latius is going first before the noun. So this is an example of an adjective of size or quantity coming before the noun that it modifies. Of course, we have no context here in which to translate this, so let's just go through all the things it could mean. It could be saying wider river, as in wider than something else. Also, it could be saying a rather wide river. Latius here could mean something like, rather wide. Or it could possibly even mean a too wide river, a river that is too wide. Okay, so it could mean any of those things, possibly. We have no context. One last thing, notice the ius ending. That's what makes latius neuter. Flumen is neuter, so it needs a neuter adjective to modify it. So latius is a third declension comparative in the neuter nominative singular. If it were masculine or feminine, it would be latior. Let's go on to number 2, latioris fluminis. Here we have the same vocabulary words as in number 1, except they're in a different case, genitive singular. Again, flumen is third declension neuter, and so fluminis is genitive singular. It means of the river, and so it has latioris modifying it. That's the genitive singular form in the neuter gender of the comparative adjective latior. Again, we have no context in which to place this. It's just an exercise, but it could possibly be saying of the wider river. It could be saying of the rather wide river, or even of the too wide river. It could possibly be expressing any of those things. Moving on to number 3, altiores ripae. Ripae is a form of the first declension feminine noun, ripa, which means bank, like the bank of a stream or river. It's nominative plural, and it's being modified by the third declension adjective altiores, which is a comparative degree adjective. Okay, this is the adjective altus, alta, altum. That's the positive form. And it can mean high, or it can also mean deep. If you're talking about water, it could be referring to deep water. But here it's referring to the height of something. Altus, alta, altum is the positive degree. Here we have the comparative degree. So it's altiores for the feminine nominative plural form. So number 3 could be saying higher banks. It could be saying rather high banks, or it could be saying banks that are too high. Again, we have no context in which to translate it. The context would help us figure out the finer shade of meaning being communicated here. We don't have that, so I'm just going through the possibilities in a mechanical kind of way, just for practice. Number 4 is next. Gravioribus talis. The word talis here, the noun, is a form of the second declension neuter noun, which is talum, and that means something like spear or javelin. You can tell by the is ending that it's either dative plural or ablative plural, and it's being modified by gravioribus. That's the adjective gravis, which means serious or heavy. That's a third declension adjective. Here it's in the comparative form. So it's not gravis, it's gravior, which means heavier or more serious. Here it's referring to an actual physical object. so it's probably best to translate it as heavy, or in this case, heavier. Again, this exercise could be dative plural or ablative plural. Just for the sake of argument, let's make it ablative plural. So grauioribus and teles together could be an ablative of means. It could be saying, by means of heavier javelins. So this exercise could be saying, by means of heavier javelins, or it could be saying, by means of rather heavy javelins, or it could be saying, by means of javelins that are too heavy. It could be expressing any of those. We don't know because we have no context. It's just an exercise for practice. Number 5 is next. Per dinciores silvas. Here we have a prepositional phrase. The word per means through, and the object of the preposition is silvas. That's the accusative plural form of silva, which means forest. That's a feminine noun of the first declension. So the basic meaning here is through forests or through the forests. And then the word dinciores is an adjective that's going to tell us what kind of forests. The adjective densus, densa, densum, in its positive form, means thick or dense. Here, dinciores is comparative, the comparative degree. So that's a third declension adjective that means denser or more dense. Dinciores is accusative plural, feminine, to agree with silvas. So number 5 could say through denser forests, or it could say through rather dense forests, or it could say through forests that are too dense. Number 6 is next. In densissimas silvas. Here we have yet another prepositional phrase. The preposition in is a two-way preposition. It takes the accusative and the ablative. When it takes the accusative, it can mean into or against. When it takes the ablative, it can mean things like on top of, or on, or inside of, or in. So here we have in taking the accusative. That means it's probably going to mean into or against. With the word silvas here, forests, it gives me the idea that we're going into the forests. So in silvas says into the forests. Again, silvas is accusative plural. And then we have a superlative adjective modifying silvas. Okay, densissimas is a form of the adjective densus, densa, densum, which means dense or thick. In number 5, we saw it in its comparative degree. Now we're seeing it in its superlative degree. So it's densissimus, densissima, densissimum. A first and second declension adjective, as all superlatives are. And so densissimas is accusative plural to match silvas. Okay, so densissimas and silvas agree with each other. So we could translate number 6 as into the densest forests. That would be the most plain and simple way to translate it, translating densissimas as densest. But keep in mind that in Latin, the superlative can be translated with the word very. So we could say into very dense forests. So it could be saying into densest forests or into very dense forests. It could be saying either one of those. Number 7 is next. A novissimo agmene. Exercise number 7 is simply a prepositional phrase. We have the preposition a, which can also be spelled ab when it comes before a vowel. And sometimes you'll see it spelled ab before the letter S. Here it's spelled a because the next word starts with a consonant. A or ab can mean from, or in an ablative of agent, it can be translated by. When you're saying that certain activity was done by someone, the preposition a or ab, that's the preposition used to express that. And the object of the preposition a is agmene. Okay, the preposition a, ab takes the ablative, and so agmene is ablative singular. That's one of our new words for this lesson. It means army on the march, line of troops, formation, things like that. So just for the sake of argument, let's say that this is an ablative of agent, that the army is doing something, or there's some kind of activity being performed by the army. So we'll translate as by, and we'll say by the army or by the formation. Some activity is being done by them. The noun agmene is being modified by the adjective novissimo. That's a superlative form of novus, noa, novum, which means new. So we could translate novissimo as newest. Notice that it is also ablative singular to agree with agmene. And this term here, novissimum agmen, that's one of our new words for this lesson. This term, novissimum agmen, means the rear guard of an army. Literally, it means the newest guard or the newest formation, but the idea is it's the last one in the sequence, and therefore it's the rear guard. So number 7, if we are treating it as if it's an ablative of agent, would say this, by the rear guard. Number 8 is next, inter novissimum hostium agmen et nostrum primum agmen. Number 8 is not a complete sentence. It's just a prepositional phrase, sort of like number 7. And it starts with the preposition inter, which means between. So it's just going to say between this thing and that thing. That's the structure of it. And the object of the preposition is agmen, which we see twice, first after the word hostium, and then again later at the end of the sentence in parentheses. We'll just treat it as though it's really there, even though it's in parentheses. So stripping it down to its barest essentials, number 8 says, inter agmen et agmen. So between, one army and another army. That's the basic structure. So let's look at the first agmen. It's being modified by the adjective novissimum. Again, novissimum and agmen together say rear guard. And those two words are sandwiching in a genitive that is possessing the agmen. Hostium is the genitive plural form of the noun hostis, which is a third declension noun that means enemy. Okay, so hostium means of the enemies. And again, it's kind of a sandwich style of word order here. Novissimum and agmen are sandwiching in the word hostium. So literally, it will say, along with the word inter, it will say between the rear guard of the enemies and some other thing. So that's it's telling us two things that something is between. And the first thing being talked about is the rear guard of the enemies. Of course, we'll translate the plural word enemies as kind of a singular collective kind of word in English. We'll say the enemy. So far what we have is between the rear guard of the enemy and now at the end of the sentence, they're going to tell us the other thing being referred to, that something is between. We see, again, the word agmen now being modified with primum. So together, primum and agmen, that's another one of our new terms for this particular lesson. Primum agmen means the front of an army or the vanguard. Here they have the word van, which we don't really use too much in English, but we use the word vanguard quite a bit. The word vanguard, that's V-A-N-G-U-A-R-D, vanguard, comes from the French expression avant-garde, A-V-A-N-T-G-A-R-D-E. So avant-garde in French means the front guard. Avant means something like before or in front of. So if you take the French expression avant-garde and you take away the A at the beginning and you leave the V, the A, and the N, and you take away the T, so you take away the A and the T from avant-garde, that leaves you with vanguard. According to the dictionary, that's where our English word vanguard comes from. It's kind of a corrupted or stripped down form of the French expression avant-garde. So primum agmen means the vanguard of an army, that is the front guard that goes in first, or as they say here, the front of an army. So in number 8, we have primum agmen. Let's just translate it as vanguard. And nostrum means our, that's O-U-R. So our vanguard, that's how we'll translate nostrum primum agmen. So number 8 as a whole, again, it's just a prepositional phrase between the rearguard of the enemy and our vanguard. Number 9 is next. Per tres potentissimos ac firmissimos populos. Number 9 is just a big prepositional phrase for practice. It's not a complete sentence. And it starts with the preposition per, which means through. And the idea is through as in moving through physical space. The direct object is populos. That means people in the sense of a people group or a nation or a tribe or an ethnic group, perhaps. So per and populos, populos is accusative plural because per takes the accusative. So per and populos together say through peoples in the sense of through nations or through tribes. Then we have several adjectives modifying populos, all accusative plural. Tres means three. So through three peoples is what we have so far. Potentissimos and firmissimos are both superlatives. Potentissimos is a superlative form of the adjective potens. That's a third declension adjective of one termination. So potentissimos says most powerful. Ac means and firmissimos is another superlative. Actually, firmus is one of our new words for this lesson. Fiermas, firma, firmum is a first and second declension adjective that means strong or firm. Here we see it again as a superlative firmissimos, which would mean strongest or firmest. So a wooden kind of translation here could say through three most powerful and strongest peoples. But we can tell from the context that that's not really what's being communicated here. The peoples are not being directly compared to anyone. The statement being made here is more of a general statement. So it would be better if we translate these superlatives using the word very. Okay, so instead of potentissimos meaning most powerful, let's say very powerful. And instead of firmissimos meaning strongest, let's translate it as very strong. So if we do that, number 9 says through three very powerful and very strong peoples. And so that makes perfect sense that way. So there's a good example of how the context can help us to determine the best translation for these superlatives. Number 10 is next. Helvetii paratiores ad bellum gerendum erunt. Here we have for the first time a complete sentence. The subject is Helvetii, and the verb is erunt. That's a future tense verb that means they will be. So the subject and verb together say, the Helvetii will be. And what will they be? They'll be paratiores. Paratiores is a form of the adjective paratus, parata, paratum, which means prepared. Here we see it in its comparative degree. The nominative singular would be paratior. Here it's nominative plural, paratiores, to agree with the Helvetii. So paratiores is a predicate adjective. So the subject verb and predicate adjective together say the Helvetii will be more prepared. Finally, we have a gerundive, ad bellum gerendum. In this kind of context, the preposition ad means for the purpose of. And then bellum means war. That's accusative singular because ad takes the accusative. And then gerendum is a gerundive. That's a future passive participle of the verb gero, which means to bear or carry. Gerendum is singular, accusative, and neuter because it's modifying bellum. So literally, Ad bellum gerundum says, for the purpose of war, to be born. In this kind of context, you translate gero as wage when it's paired with the noun bellum. So the idea is to wage war. So literally it would say, for the purpose of war, to be waged. So a very literal wooden rendering of this sentence would say this: the Helvetii will be more prepared for the purpose of war to be waged. But we can smooth out the translation of the gerundive if we say, for the purpose of waging war. We flip it around a bit so that the word bellum becomes the direct object. And we take gerundum and make it sound as though it's active, not passive. So what that gives us is, for the purpose of waging war. So that's a very common thing you'll see in English translations of gerundives. They switch it around a bit. They make the gerundive active, and then they make the noun the direct object of that activity. Now, as far as the word paratiores, there could be some unspoken group that the Helvetii are being compared to. This sentence could be saying that the Helvetii will be more prepared than someone else for the purpose of waging war. Or it could be making a general statement about them. It could be saying that the Helvetii will be rather prepared for the purpose of waging war. We just don't know. We don't have enough context. So really it could be either of those. So number 10 says this: the Helvetii will be more prepared or rather prepared for the purpose of waging war. Number 11 is next. Horum omnium fortissimi sunt belgae. The subject here is the word fortissimi, the verb is sunt, and belgae is the predicate nominative. Fortissimi is a form of the adjective fortis, which means brave, and here we see it in its superlative degree. So fortissimi means the bravest, and it's nominative plural. This particular usage of an adjective is what we call a substantive. Fortissimi literally means the bravest, but you must assume an understood word such as men, soldiers, people, something like that. So the subject is fortissimi. It means the bravest people, the bravest men, whatever. It's a substantive. And then sunt means are. And then belgae is the predicate nominative. That means Belgians. So the basic structure of the sentence is, the bravest are the Belgians. We have a demonstrative here that's horum. That's a form of hic, haec, hoc. Horum is genitive plural. So it means of these, and it's being paired with the adjective omnium. That's the third declension adjective omnis, which means all. Omnium is also genitive plural. So together, horum and omnium say, of all of these. So number 11 altogether says, of all of these, the bravest are the Belgians. If you really wanted to, you could switch around the word order and say, the bravest of all of these are the Belgians. If you want to do that, that's fine. You get basically the same thing with a slightly different word order. But the way we did it reflects more of the Latin word order. Number 12 is next. Apud Helvetios nobelissimus fuit urgetorix. Here we have another complete sentence. The sentence structure is similar to number 11. Here, nobilissimus is another adjective acting as a substantive. In fact, that particular adjective is one of our new words for this lesson. Nobilis, nobilis, nobile. That's a third declension adjective of two terminations, which means famous, noble, well-born. Well-born in the sense of being born into the upper class or the aristocratic class. And so nobilissimus is the superlative degree of that adjective. So nobilissimus means most well-born, most noble, most famous, most aristocratic. Again, Nobilissimus is a substantive, so it means most noble in the sense of the most noble man, the most noble guy, the most noble person. You have to understand a word that's left out there. Fuit is a verb of being. That's a perfect tense verb that means he, she, or it was. And then orgeterix is a predicate nominative. So the basic structure of this sentence is the most noble person was orgeterix. Finally, we have a prepositional phrase, and that is apud helvetios. The word apud is a preposition that can mean different things like at, among, with. It can mean at the house of. And it takes the accusative case. Here, helvetios is accusative plural. So apud helvetios means something like among the helvetii. So number 12 as a whole says this. Among the helvetii, the most noble guy or the most noble person was orgeterix. Again, the idea of most noble here is not the idea that he had the strongest character or was the toughest person in adversity, the way we use the word noble in English. It means noble in the sense of he was the most aristocratic, the most high-ranking in social rank. He was the top guy with regard to probably land ownership, having people under him who worked for him. That's the idea, is he was the upper classist guy, at the top of the food chain as far as being part of the aristocracy. That's the meaning of it. Number 13 is next. Iter est facilius. This is a simple sentence. Iter means way, journey, route, road. Est means is, and facilius is a comparative adjective. It's a form of facilis, which means easy. That's a third declension adjective. So facilior would be the comparative form for masculine and feminine in the nominative. And then facilius is neuter. Notice the ius ending. Why is it neuter? Because the word iter is neuter. So iter is the subject, est is the verb, and then facilius is a predicate adjective, modifying iter. So 13 says something like, the march is easier. But that translation doesn't really capture what's being said here. There's no comparison to anything else, and it seems like whoever wrote this is trying to make a general statement about the march. So the best way to translate facilius here is with the word rather. So we could say, the march is rather easy. Number 14 is next. Iter erat non difficillimum. Again, we have the word iter, which means march, route, road, or way. We can just translate it as march. Erat means was. That's an imperfect tense verb of being. Non means not. And difficillimum is a superlative adjective. That's a form of the third declension adjective, difficilus, which means difficult. This particular superlative does not take the ISSIMUS ending. Instead, we have doubling of the letter L. So we get difficillimum as a neuter superlative adjective. So the basic meaning of difficillimum would be most difficult. So number 14 says something like, the march was not the most difficult, but it might sound better to use the word very to translate difficillimum and say, the march was not very difficult. Number 15 is next. Agri sunt latissimi et ferracissimi. Agri means fields. That's the second declension masculine noun ager in the nominative plural. So that means fields. Sunt means they are. And then we have two predicate adjectives, latissimi and ferracissimi. Both of them are superlatives. Okay, so the fields are latissimi and ferracissimi. Latissimi is a superlative form of the adjective latus, latus, lata, latum, means wide. So we could translate latissimi as widest, or possibly very wide. So agri sunt latissimi could say the fields are the widest, or it could say the fields are very wide. We just don't know. There's not enough context. Ferracissimi is a superlative form of the adjective ferrax. That's actually one of our new words for this lesson. Ferrax, ferracus means fertile. So number 15 says, the fields are the widest and the most fertile. But it might sound better to say this: the fields are very wide and very fertile. It really could be either of those. Number 16 is next. Publius Considius peritissimus habebatur. Okay, the subject here is a person's name, Publius Considius, and we have a passive verb, that's habebatur. That's a form of the verb habeo, which means to have or hold. Habebatur is imperfect tense, third person singular, passive. The TUR ending tells us it's third person singular passive. The BA that's stuck there before the personal ending tells us that it's imperfect. So habebatur means he, she, or it was held. Okay, so along with Publius Considius, the subject and verb says this: Publius Considius was held. And then we have a predicate adjective. Peritissimus is a superlative form of the adjective peritus. Peritus means experienced. So peritissimus means most experienced, or perhaps very experienced. So literally, number 16 says this: Publius Considius was held most experienced, or Publius Considius was held very experienced. There's a footnote here that can help us smooth out our translation a bit further. Notice that footnote number 1 is next to the word habebatur, and it says, was considered. So when you say that someone was held to be something, or was held as something, that's the same as if you said they were considered to be something. So number 16, it sounds good if we translate it like this: Publius Considius was considered very experienced. It could possibly mean Publius Considius was considered the most experienced, but most likely it just means he was considered to be very experienced. So we'll use the word very to translate peritissimus. Number 17 is next. Mons altissimus impendebat. The subject here is mons, which means mountain. Impendebat, well, that's actually one of our new vocabulary words for this lesson. Impendeo carries with it the idea of looming over you or hanging over you. The word they give here is overhang. Impendebat is third person singular, imperfect tense. Remember that the imperfect tense communicates continuous action in past time. So the basic subject and verb here says the mountain or a mountain was overhanging. Altissimus is a superlative adjective. That's a form of altus, alta, altum, which can mean high, or if you're talking about water, it can mean deep. In this case, we're talking about a mountain, so we'll translate it as high. Therefore, altissimus will say the highest, or we could translate it as very high. Either of those. So number 17 could say this. It could say the highest mountain was overhanging. But most likely, altissimus here just means very high. So number 17 would probably say a very high mountain was overhanging, or a very high mountain was hanging over. You know, if you're at the foot of a mountain, then the mountain sort of looms over you or hangs over you. That's the sense of it. Number 18 is next, and we're going to have to turn the page in the middel of it. Helvetii legatos nobilissimos civitatis mittunt. The subject here is Helvetii, and the verb is mittunt. That's a form of the verb mitto, which means send. So mittunt is third person plural, present tense. So the subject and verb here says this: the Helvetii send, or the Helvetii are sending. Legatos here means envoys or ambassadors. You can see the footnote here. Footnote number 2 says, as ambassadors. And then it says, in apposition with nobilissimos. Okay, nobilissimos is a superlative adjective. It means most noble or very noble. So what we have so far would say this: the Helvetii are sending ambassadors. And then a further description is provided by nobilissimos, the most noble. The Helvetii are sending ambassadors, the most noble, or very noble. We don't have the full picture yet. Finally, Cohortus is a genitive singular noun that is possessing the legatos and the nobilissimos. That's the third declension noun, Cohortus, which means state, or something like that. So there are a couple of different ways we could treat this. Notice that legatos and nobilissimos both are accusative plural. So which one is really the direct object? Is it the Helvetii are sending ambassadors, or the Helvetii are sending the most noble people? Nobilissimos could be a substantive. We should definitely read nobilissimos along with Cohortus. So in that case, it will say the most noble people or most noble men of the state. And if we look at footnote number 2 again, they want us to translate legatos with the word as, saying as ambassadors. So the translation that they're guiding us toward would read like this, with nobilissimos as the direct object. And so it might say this: the Helvetii are sending the most noble men of the state as ambassadors. So that's the kind of sense of it that they're trying to guide us toward. Again, when you have a noun that provides additional explanation or additional description for a noun that's already been named, we call that apposition. We say that legatos is standing in apposition. I've mentioned this in the past. You can pile up a list of nouns to describe someone or something. If my Aunt Martha is a mother and she's the mayor of a town and she's the wife of a guy named Bob, I could say, here's my Aunt Martha, a mother, the mayor, wife of Bob. When I do that, I'm just piling up nouns to describe Aunt Martha. And so all those nouns that I'm piling up there continue to describe Martha, whom I have already named. So we can say that those nouns stand in apposition with the word Martha. So that's what we have here. We have legatos standing in apposition with nobilissimos. And nobilissimos is a substantive. So again, number 18 will say something like this: the Helvetii are sending the most noble men of the state as ambassadors. Number 19 is next. Una ex parte Helvetia flumine reino latissimo atque altissimo continetur. There are several parts to this sentence. The subject here is Helvetia. That's the name of the place where the Helvetians live. Today it would be Switzerland. And the verb is continetur. Continetur is a form of the verb contineo, which means to hem in, to perhaps border, or to hold in, things like that. You can translate it as bounded in the sense of something making boundaries around something. So Helvetia and continetur together say Helvetia is bounded, Helvetia is hemmed in, Helvetia is contained, something like that. We'll get more context as we translate. Una ex parte is a prepositional phrase. ex is the preposition. Parte is ablative singular because ex takes the ablative. Una means one, and it agrees with parte. It's also ablative singular. Remember that adjectives of size or quantity often come before the noun they modify. So here we have una coming before parte. So if we wanted to rearrange it into more of an English-sounding word order, we would say ex una parte. But what does it mean? Literally, it means out of one side. The Latin word pars can mean several different things. It can mean part, it can mean direction, or it can mean side, or it can also mean a political faction, like a political party almost. So una ex parte, as a little phrase, it means something like on one side or from one direction. Now we're going to have lots of ablatives of means showing us by what means Helvetia is bounded. Okay, Flumine Rheno means the Rhine River. Flumine means river, Rheno means Rhine. So what we have so far would say on one side or from one direction, Helvetia is bounded by the Rhine River. And now we have a couple of adjectives standing in apposition with the Rhine River. Latissimo and altissimo are superlative adjectives that are modifying Rheno. Notice that they are also ablative singular. All these nouns here are ablative because it's ablative of means. So latissimo is a superlative that means very wide or widest. Atque means and altissimo means highest or very high. But as I've mentioned before, when you're talking about water, altus, alta, altum, that adjective can actually mean deep. And so here, we're talking about a river. So altissimo here does not mean highest. Here it means deepest, or really it's better to translate it as very deep. So let's translate latissimo as very wide and altissimo as very deep. And here's what we get. On one side or from one direction, Helvetia is bounded by the Rhine River, very wide and very deep. Number 20 is next. Cohortes longiore itinere circumductae sunt. The subject here is the word cohortes. That's the third declension noun cohors, which is actually one of our new words for this lesson, and it means cohort. And a cohort was a division of the Roman army. The legion was divided into 10 of them, and so you might compare a cohort in today's army to a battalion. A regiment or a brigade can be divided up into battalions. A battalion can be divided up into companies. Companies are divided up into platoons. Platoons are divided up into squads, and so forth. A platoon has roughly 50 or 60 soldiers. 4 of those make a company. 5 of those make a battalion. Several battalions make a brigade or a regiment. So a cohort is something like a battalion in today's army. So the subject here is cohorts, and then the verb here is a compound tense, circumductae sunt. This is a perfect tense passive verb. We have the perfect passive participle, circumductae, and then we have a helping verb, which is a verb of being. So that's a perfect tense passive verb. It's actually a form of the verb circumduco, which is one of our new verbs for this lesson. Circumductae sunt says they were led around. Okay, duco means lead, circum means around. So circumduco means to lead around. Again, we have the perfect passive participle form, circumductae. So along with the subject, cohortes, it says the cohorts were led around. Now we have an ablative of means, which is itinere. That's the third declension noun iter, which can mean road, route, march, way, journey, all those kinds of things. Probably route would be a good way to translate it here. So what we have so far would say, the cohorts were led around by means of a root. And what kind of root? A longiore root. Longiore is a comparative adjective. We have the adjective longus, longa, longum, which means long. So in its comparative degree, it's longior. And so here, longior is in the ablative singular because it's modifying itinere. So longiore is neuter, ablative singular, along with itinere. So this exercise could say, the cohorts were led around by means of a longer route. But the feeling I get here from the context is that they're saying it's a rather long route. So let's not translate it as longer. Let's translate it as rather long. And in fact, it could even mean too long. It could possibly be saying the cohorts were led around by a too long route. In other words, by a route that was just too long. We don't fully know. We don't have a complete, context here. I think when we get there in our Caesar reading, we'll see this same wording and we'll know more about the actual context. So probably the best way to translate it here with no context is to say the cohorts were led around by a rather long route. Number 21 was omitted. I asked you to skip that one. So that means we're finished with this lesson. Thanks for all your hard work, and we will see you again next time in Lesson 37.